Welcome to our fifth webinar introducing you to the new and updated standards. Thank you again for spending your lunchtime with us. My name is Mary Catherine. I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm a physiotherapist and the manager of the practice advice team here at the college. I joined the college as a practice advisor in 2020, and prior to joining the college, I spent my career as a clinician in a variety of settings, including acute care and rehab hospitals, and spent the last 15 years as a clinician and clinic director of a multidisciplinary private practice. My co-presenter today is Evgenia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Evgenia, and I also use the pronouns she, her, and I am a policy analyst here at the college. I have also been here since 2020. What a fun year for us all. And I've been working closely along the practice advice team for the past couple of years to review our standards of practice. We are also joined today by a member of our communications team, Allison, who will be helping to collect your questions and manage the Q&A function, as well as dropping links into the chat to relevant resources as they come up today. So today we are reviewing the very last group of standards in our process to adopt the standards from the national package. And these are the boundary violations, sexual abuse, and supervision standards. As with all of the previous standards webinars, you will have the opportunity to send your questions through the Q&A function in Zoom throughout the presentation. So we will be taking some time to answer your questions at the end of each standard, but do feel free to type in your questions as they might come up, and we will get to it during those breaks. And before we begin today, I'll turn it back over to MC to present our territory acknowledgement.
Thanks, Evgenia. We would like to first ground our presentation with land acknowledgement. Personally, I identify as someone with heritage in Ireland and Scotland. I acknowledge the privilege and benefits I hold as a result of the colonial structures here in Canada, and I commit to ongoing learning and reconciliation. We would like to acknowledge with respect that the land on which the college offices sit is in the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. These lands are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also recognize that the meeting place of Toronto, traditionally known as Tika Toronto, is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is within the lands of the Dish with One Spoon Covenant. We would like to encourage you to reflect on the lands you call home and how you came to inhabit them, and on the Indigenous communities who have a traditional kinship with these lands. Those of you joining from outside of Toronto are also encouraged to learn about the traditional keepers of your territories. Over to you, Evgenia.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. So this is a very exciting time for us because we have now wrapped up the process to adopt 16 national physiotherapy standards for our practice environment here in Ontario. So the national package of standards have been developed in collaboration with physiotherapy regulators in every province, and they describe where practice is similar across the country. So what we've done is we have taken those standards and applied them and updated them just to reflect how Ontario might be a little bit different from the rest of the country. So accounting for our unique practice environment while also keeping and reflecting the similarities across the rest of the country. So we kicked this off in late 2023, and I have to say it is crazy how fast 2+ years have flown. So we always approach our standards review under the principle that standards are developed by and for the physiotherapy profession. So they really reflect the expectations and values that PTs like yourselves believe are essential for patient care, effective practice, and of course, public interest. Our role then at the college is to bring your collective insights together through the consultation process, formalize them into the standards that you see today, and then share them back with you in a way that we hope is clear and workable for practice. And this is an ongoing process for us. So we have guidance documents that will elaborate on the expectations in the standards, and we are developing new guidance to align with the updated standards continuously. So as things change, that guidance might change as well, making sure that we're always relevant and current as new things come up. So that's just a little bit about the standards review process. And before we dive into the 3 standards today, we can first launch just a very quick poll. So if we can get the poll up now. And this is just, have you commented on any of these three standards when they went out for consultation? So boundaries and sexual abuse would have went out in March and supervision in June. So we'll give everybody a quick chance to respond here before sharing the results. Okay, and if we can get the results up now. Okay, that is okay. It is great to know, and thank you so much, everybody, for responding. There are always going to be opportunities to respond to future consultations if they interest you at all. So let's now get into the fifth and final group of standards. And we'll begin with the boundary violations standard, which has replaced the college's previous combined standard for boundary violations and sexual abuse. And so this standard came into effect on November 1st. The purpose of the standard is that physiotherapists establish and maintain appropriate physical, social, and emotional boundaries. And the outcome for patients is that they can expect that the physiotherapist will treat them with dignity and respect and maintain appropriate professional boundaries in all interactions. Turning to the performance expectations in the standard, the expectations first highlight that physios must be aware of how power and power imbalances, trust, respect, and physical closeness, and this is both with patients and colleagues that they might work with, impact the therapeutic relationship. So this really means being aware that you are in a position of power and authority as a physiotherapist, since patients rely on you to make decisions about their healthcare. While this power imbalance itself is normal in the healthcare context, it must never comprise or compromise a patient's care, and that's really just the goal of the standard. It is also important, according to the standard, that you not enter into therapeutic or patient relationships in the first place if you know that you won't be able to maintain your professional judgment or objectivity with that person. So next, as with anything else, obtaining a patient's informed consent is a massive component of maintaining professional boundaries. So this includes making sure to clearly explain to the patient the procedures or treatment steps that you have planned and confirming that the patient consents to those procedures, ensuring that any barriers to consent have been addressed as well. Next, the standard highlights that physios must recognize that each patient's level of comfort and their individual boundaries may be different depending on their experiences of culture, their age, their values, and any other personal attributes. So really being mindful of those experiences and differences when providing care and being attentive to the patient's cues, allowing supports that they might need, that really achieves this goal of the standard. So the standard then gives examples of what the statement means by physical, social, and emotional boundaries. So kind of giving examples as to how those three facets come into play. When it comes to appropriate physical boundaries, the standard requires that PTs uphold this through things like proactively providing options for draping or other physical barriers and ensuring privacy when the patient is dressing or undressing, making sure that physical distance is respected. Next is maintaining appropriate social boundaries, which includes things like never attempting to promote or persuade patients to a personal view, such as religion, spirituality, or politics. Emotional boundaries, according to the standard, includes but is not limited to not using your professional role as a means of intentionally pursuing personal relationships with patients, former patients, or caregivers. If boundary violations do occur, the standard requires that you identify and address them proactively, taking steps to resolve the issue while documenting the actions that are taken. And if boundaries are not able to be maintained after the actions are taken, that therapeutic relationship must be discontinued. Okay, so with that overview, I'll now turn it over to MC to take us through what might be new when it comes to this standard.
Thanks, Evgenia. So, this is a big one, right? Obviously what's new is that it's now separated from the sexual abuse standard. And I think that it really lets physiotherapists dig into this a little bit more and consider it a little bit more. I think that this is probably one of the standards. All of them are important for us as practitioners, but I think this is one that physios will come back to time and again to review it, to spend time on it, to consider it. boundaries and boundary violations are probably the most frequent reason that physiotherapists and patients call the practice advice service. We can discuss with you when the boundary violations happen from the physiotherapist side, but also if it's something that you've encountered or from the patient side. It's really always going to be up to you as the therapist or up to the patient themselves. It's not up to me as a practice advisor to determine if a boundary violation has happened, but it will be on that person who's experiencing it based on their own history, their own boundaries, the cultural context, so many other things. So the new parts of this standard are really that it is exploring boundaries in a context of social, physical, and psychological. So sometimes people may have thought that a professional boundary was really just about draping or putting up a physical barrier. This really encourages us to think more broadly and really look at that person specifically in front of us. It talks about how the boundaries are expected to be upheld, of course, with patients, but also anyone to whom we're assigning care. So that could be the PTA, or that could be a student. Also considering those boundaries with patients' families and with our general colleagues. It, I think, for the first time really spells out this understanding and concept of the awareness of power in the healthcare relationship and the dynamics of power. And we're going to explore that a little bit more in some of the questions that you brought up. It has this expectation for physiotherapists to be mindful of culture, values of age, and really experiences of trauma. So again, looking at that patient-centered care, rounding out the care all around. And of course, looking and considering that those physical boundaries, but the expectations around draping and preserving a patient's privacy while dressing or undressing is also a new aspect of the standard. So going towards the next question. So when you sign up for the webinar and during the consultation process, we took lots of questions around boundary violations standard. And so we're going to kind of reach some of them now. You're encouraged to ask us questions today as well during the Zoom call today. So if you have questions that we aren't addressing, by all means, enter them, and Allison will forward those to us. So let's talk a little bit about power imbalance. As physiotherapists, we hold the balance of power in the healthcare appointment because that patient in front of us is coming to us for relief of pain or help returning to their life. You have information about the patient based on their history that they've shared with you, family history. You have information and knowledge based on your training and expertise. So that means we know a lot more about them than they know about us. And then, of course, compounding the inherent power structure in a healthcare appointment are the power structures that exist in our society more broadly. So, of course, some members of society hold more power based on things like our skin color, our gender, our sexual orientation, many other factors. We did explore this concept of power and the power imbalance in a blog that we published last year. Allison's going to link it to you if you hadn't had a chance to review it. But there are ways power doesn't have to be negative, and there are ways that we can share our power or empower a patient during an appointment. I'd love to hear from the physios on the call today. How are some ways that you might have of sharing your power with patients during an appointment? We can look at those if you keep it adding these to the chat. I'm happy to review those. One of the questions we got is, can I provide treatment to friends and family? So if you remember, the previous iteration of the boundaries violation had very specific patients or family members that we could and couldn't treat. This has it a little bit more broadly, that you're considering that you have to consider if there's a risk to objectivity, to patient safety, and to professional boundaries with who you're going to treat. So, for example, family members or people with whom you are close to may hold back important information, expect special treatment, or may be uncomfortable giving honest feedback. So it's your responsibility as the physiotherapist to make sure the personal relationship doesn't compromise their care. And because of those risks, physios should refrain from treating people they have the close personal relationships with, like friends or family. Now, the conflict of interest standard does expect you as a physio to identify situations of potential conflicts of interest and avoid treating someone with whom you have a close personal relationship. And there is an explanation within that standard that close personal relationships exist between an individual and their romantic or sexual partner, children, parents, and close friends, but it could also exist between individuals with whom we're not necessarily related, business partners, past romantic partners, and others. So that it's a very unhelpful comment of, can I provide friends and treatment to friends and family? It depends, and it would depend on all of those situations. Another question we got was, how do I determine when objectivity cannot be maintained? So if you have a relationship, for example, with a patient in another capacity, so maybe the patient that comes in is also your child's teacher, or it's a neighbor with whom you have a bit of a history, or other people on the street have a history and you know some things, and you may not be able to see them in an impartial way. If you feel like you couldn't ask some very personal questions, or if you already have an opinion about this person because of prior interactions, it might be difficult to remain objective. And so in these cases, you should consider what's in the patient's best interest and likely refer them to another practitioner. Now, the question, of course, is what to do if a patient violates my boundary. So the best advice we can give when you experience a boundary violation as the healthcare provider is to not ignore it. It's really important to address any kind of comments or behaviors that could be putting pressure on a boundary violation. I would say very often, more often than not, physiotherapists tend to ignore a mild boundary or boundary violation, or put something that's putting pressure on that concept of the line. And it's only when it's gone too far and now maybe that physiotherapist feels unsafe, or maybe they feel like there's no way of resetting and now they have to address it. So if a patient puts pressure on the professional boundary, or if you feel like there's a comment or an action that's occurred that violates your boundary, the best thing to do is to stop treatment, stop the care, and very professionally address why that behavior or that comment could threaten the therapeutic relationship and how they can correct that. Now, it's important to give patients an opportunity to correct it. Maybe they weren't aware that their comment was offensive. Maybe they weren't aware that that action could be perceived in a certain way. So provide them with an opportunity to correct it. Again, if there are feelings of unsafety, or the situation is unsafe, the college does not want you to put yourself in an unsafe situation. So there would not need to be necessarily an opportunity for that person to correct behavior if there's a situation of safety. And for questions around whether or not, and we're going to touch on this again, but later, but if there's questions around discharge or the need for discharge, you would look to the duty of care standard for the guidance on that. Okay, questions around how do I make social media interactions or communicate with people over social media and maintain professional boundaries? So we have guidance for you as physiotherapists. We have principles for physiotherapists using social media, and Allison can link that for you now. But of course, your interactions on social media should be held to the same standard as your in-person communications. Consider putting time limits as to when you're going to respond to messages or comments. So for example, only respond during business hours, avoid responding on weekends, avoid responding at nighttime. You know, people get into trouble checking social media after a night of socializing, and maybe their perspective isn't the best. Maybe they're overtired, and they should avoid responding to patients or members of the public in those ways. So make sure you're try to keep those to business hours. There was a question around providing physio services in smaller rural communities and how do I maintain objectivity with patients if they are also close personal relationships. So recognizing there's large parts of Ontario that are in small communities, and it's very hard to maintain or to expect that patients will come in and we don't have prior knowledge of them, we don't have a prior relationship with them. So the important piece in these situations is to really consider how you're going to mitigate that lack of objectivity. So you could consider, for example, engaging with a colleague from another community to have them review your assessment or your treatment plan. You can, don't forget virtual care is a great way to kind of expand the physiotherapy pool in a small community if it's appropriate for the patient that's in front of you. We had a physio once who was a physio at a long-term care facility and their grandparent was being admitted. They were the physio was the only physio available. So obviously that wouldn't be fair to the grandparent to not receive the physio care that they needed. And so this physio was able to engage with her OT colleague to have her review the assessment and treatment plan to ensure for objectivity and thoroughness. And of course, the physio is encouraged to document that pre-existing relationship because transparency is key to avoiding any kind of a conflict of interest. Okay, moving on. One of the questions, because this new standard does talk about trauma-informed care and being having that trauma-informed lens. So trauma-informed care really focuses on creating a safe space that is built on empowering the patient, on respect for the patient, compassion, collaborating with them, and building their trust. So there's some really concrete steps that can lead to a more trauma-informed approach. Of course, there are courses that you can take on this, but the college has developed some resources for you as well, including a blog about how to be more trauma-informed in your approach. And it can be things like just slowing down, asking the patient in front of you if there's anything that could make them feel safe and comfortable while you're working together. Active listening, of course, is an important part. Asking a patient for their pronouns on an intake so that you can use the appropriate pronouns before you ever lay a hand on a patient, or bringing them along in that conversation, letting them know what you're going to do, what needs to occur during the assessment and treatment, asking if they're okay with physical touch before you proceed. Keep an eye out for physical signs of discomfort. Even if the patient isn't necessarily verbalizing anything, maybe you can watch for physical signs of discomfort and address those. Don't ignore what those are. Of course, using your patient-centered communication, which if you haven't had a chance to review that, we do have a patient-centered communication module for you. And being really mindful and thoughtful about using barriers, draping, and only undressing patients with the minimal amount of that needs to be exposed for the treatment that's there. Questions came up around being mindful about cultural safety and respect within the professional boundaries. And so cultural safety means creating that environment that's free from discrimination and where patients feel respected and heard. So you want to recognize what feels professional and appropriate, and that might be different for you than it is for that patient in front of you. So ask, don't assume that you know what this person needs based on how they're presenting to you. Patients might have very specific expectations related to their culture, around touch, around modesty, around decision-making. So invite them to share what feels comfortable for them and how they would like to be involved. If there is an ability for you to adjust your approach to respect those cultural needs without compromising patient safety or your professional responsibilities, we would encourage you to do that. And of course, reflect on your own biases. You want to be aware of how your own background and assumptions can influence your boundary decisions. So we've got resources. I'm plugging lots of resources today, but we have resources for you. There's a video about developing a sensitive practice, and we have that blog for you around how to make your practice more trauma informed. And then finally, we had questions around what are appropriate ways to drape or dress a patient. And of course, it depends. Every patient is different. There's no right way to drape. You should try to apply like consistent principles around draping, which include privacy, safety, and the clinical need. So consent, always start with consent, explain why draping, why undressing might be necessary, always ask permission. Only uncover those areas that need to be uncovered, keep those other areas covered. Practice how to drape. If you notice some draping is slipping, take the time to fix that. Never ignore that draping has slipped or pretend that you haven't seen it, because if it is slipping, the patient knows it's slipping. Give that patient some autonomy around how they're being draped or covered. So, for example, let them hold the drape. We would encourage you to never unclip a patient's bra unless they are physically unable to do so and you have their clear consent to do so. And again, don't assume and make assumptions around a patient's comfort level based on their culture. Ask about their privacy needs and their comfort. And be clear with your communication. Remember that sometimes we are the first people to be touching a patient in a long time. So really take that time to explain what you're going to be doing, what needs to happen, and make modifications if possible. Okay, so last thing I just thought maybe to summarize, because it's a lot of questions and it might feel like a lot of new for people. Um, how does this ultimately, how does it affect my practice? Like, how does this standard and some of the expectations with it affect my practice? So I'd like to make this sales pitch to you that good professional boundaries and patient-centered care make patients feel safe, and ultimately they enhance your therapeutic outcomes. It is that special sauce that leads people to return to you time and time again, that want to recommend you as a physio, and that really elevates your level of care and makes you stand out as a great practitioner. I think that this new boundary violation standard is an opportunity for physios to really consider boundary violations that can occur from either side. It's an opportunity for you to do some training with your staff, considering, do you know what to look for with a boundary violation? Do you know how to interpret that? Do you know how to respond to it? Um, Consider what type of boundary violations would be a discussion versus a hard discharge from physiotherapy care, and how does that happen? What would be the steps to follow? So really take the time to review the guide that's linked to this boundary violation standard. Take the time to review lots of these resources. And just a reminder that in terms of upholding your professional boundaries in the workplace, you're wearing your physio hat at all times. So your colleagues also want you to uphold your professional behavior, particularly anyone to whom you're assigning care, such as an assistant or a student. There's that expectation that you are maintaining those boundaries. And of course, a reminder that the standard requires you to not start a romantic or intimate relationship with someone who you are supervising. Kenya, over to you.
All right, like MC said, that was a lot of information. So let's break into a very quick palate cleansing poll. And this is which college resource do you think is the most helpful for learning more about professional boundaries? So is it guidance to the standard or FAQs just because of the interpretation? Is it a case of the month because examples are very helpful? Is it a webinar where the sampling bias is not lost on me? Or is it e-learning modules because of the self-paced learning? So giving you guys a quick moment to respond. And then we can pull up the results. All right, thank you guys so much for responding. Case of the month comes out on top. Amazing. The visualization of practical examples is 100% very, very useful to applying some of this theory in practice, and this will absolutely help us to plan additional resources for professional boundaries. So before we move on to the sexual abuse standard, do we have any questions, any comments about the boundary violation standard? So I see that there are a couple of notes in the Q&A about how do we share MC's earlier question about how do we mitigate against that power imbalance in our practice. So I'll share the couple that came up, and maybe MC, you can comment on those as well if you'd like. The first one is by educating patients on their injury or condition and teaching them self-management skills. So that's empowering patients. And I would agree that that is very empowering for patients and education and self-management. And the second is informed consent being a great way to share power. So those are both amazing notes.
Yeah, those are great examples of how to share power. Agree. There's a question around for the professional boundaries, the time duration to refrain from becoming romantically involved with a patient is still 1 year from the last date of treatment. Yes, that remains. That is also will be touched upon in the sexual abuse standard.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, and you can type those in if something else comes up about boundaries. But if there are no other questions, then that is actually a great segue into the sexual abuse standard, which of course has also gained independence from the previous boundaries and sexual abuse standard and has also come into effect on November 1st. So the purpose here is that physiotherapists do not engage in sexual abuse, and this includes conduct, behavior, or remarks of a sexual nature. The outcome for patients is that they can expect that their interactions with physiotherapists are completely free from that definition of sexual abuse. Oops, let me go back for a second. So the performance expectations here, although the standard is now on its own, the expectations should still be very familiar as to what we had previously. And a lot of that is because a lot of what we're talking about today has already been decided for us by the law, which is Ontario's Regulated Health Professions Act. So first things first, very important, do not commence an intimate or sexual relationship with your patients. That's kind of the key component of the standard. It is very important to note that under the law and due to the inherent power imbalance between healthcare providers and their patients, patients cannot ever offer valid consent to a sexual relationship. Now, on the flip side of that, you must also not provide treatment to your spouses or any individual with whom you have a sexual relationship. So for physiotherapists in Ontario, if you treat a spouse as a patient, this is still, for the most part, considered sexual abuse because of the sexual acts associated with your pre-existing relationship with that person. So it would still be sexual abuse, and physiotherapists under the law do not have a spousal exemption and may not do that. There are some very limited exceptions, of course, like an emergency or minor circumstances, but for the most part, it is prohibited. Next, physiotherapists must not engage in any form of sexual abuse with patients, and under the law, this includes conduct, behavior, or remarks of a sexual nature. So it's really important to note that this is not just limited to touching in a sexual manner. Also, under Ontario law, a therapeutic relationship with a patient does extend for at least 1 year after active treatment ends. And so that hopefully can answer that question. For example, if a patient has been discharged or has completed their treatment, they still remain a patient under the law for at least 1 year. So we say at least because there could be a reason why they need to remain a patient for longer than that, such as if there's an ongoing risk of power imbalance or dependence, for example. And that would mean that a year is actually not enough to fully disentangle your therapeutic relationship from that patient, and it could be a little bit longer, but it would definitely still be 1 year for sure. Now, next, under the standard, if a treatment could be mistaken for sexual in nature, so for example, if it involves a sensitive area of the body, you must make sure that you explain to patients why you're doing it and its therapeutic purpose, encourage an open discussion of concerns, and of course, obtain informed consent before and during treatment. And the last point of the standard is really to stress the importance of mandatory reporting if you believe another regulated health professional is engaging in sexual abuse. Okay, over to you, MC, for the practical aspects of the standard.
Great. So, of course, again, this is now separate from the boundary violation, so it does provide clearer guidance. All expectations, the reporting obligations, and the definitions essentially remain unchanged from a previous version. The new guidance relates more to power imbalance and gives a clear explanation that there cannot be a consensual relationship between a healthcare provider and their patient. So, some of your questions related specifically to, are there any circumstances when I can treat my spouse? And so in Ontario, physiotherapists don't have spousal exemption, which means that you cannot treat them in terms of bringing them to the office, assessing, providing treatment, billing for their care. The exceptions for treating a spouse include emergency care or when care is minor in nature, and in both cases, no fees can be charged. So emergency treatment would be considered something urgent, very short term, something that couldn't be reasonably delayed until you saw another provider, for example, or there's no practical alternative for care in a timely way. So, for example, first aid or stabilization of a fracture or of an injury of some kind. Minor treatment would likely be something that's very kind of low risk, brief, something that doesn't establish or require an ongoing therapeutic relationship. So it could be something, again, like bracing, giving some advice on how to move safely through an acute strain or helping with some positioning. Um, these are meant, of course, to protect the patient in these situations. So your spouse is the patient, ensuring that they can access care that is objective and unbiased, because it's very difficult to provide unbiased and objective care to a family member. Um, there was a question around what kind of circumstances could prolong a patient relationship greater than 1 year after discharge. So the consideration in this is that if the patient has either ongoing needs or remains dependent on the physiotherapist after even 1 year since the last clinical interaction, this often happens when there's any kind of a legal matter related to the care that was provided. So very oftentimes, maybe someone's been discharged from care, but their case hasn't come through, or we may be asked to write a report, or we may be subpoenaed to appear in court. That means that that patient remains dependent on us as a physio for their care and for their goals. And so we should be refraining from starting any kind of an intimate or personal relationship with that person or having any kind of sexual relationship with them. The standard talks about clearly explaining treatment that could be perceived as sexual in nature. And what exactly does this mean? Well, this means that any care that we're providing that a patient could misinterpret as sexual in nature. For example, think about treating sensitive body parts such as pectoral muscles, glutes, inner thighs, of course, pelvic floor treatment. Anything that will require treatment on those areas, we need to be mindful to spend more time on explaining to patients why we're assessing what we're assessing, how it's linked to the reason that they came to see us in the first place. We make assumptions sometimes that patients have an understanding, for example, that they're coming to see us with a knee problem. So, of course, we have to look at their hip because the gluteal muscle affects the bone that rotates, the bone that is part of the knee. But that's something that we know very well as physios because we have that knowledge and expertise in anatomy and biomechanics, but the patient in front of us doesn't. So it's not always clear to a patient that came in with patellofemoral pain, for example, why you are touching their glute or their bum. Same with pectoral muscles and, back pain, upper back pain. Why do you have to touch the front of my chest when my pain is all at the back of my neck? And so really making those connections for patients and helping to explain to them what you're doing and getting their consent to touch those areas. And document that you've had that conversation. That's how we know that you've had the consent conversation with your patients. And then finally, can I discharge a patient and then date them? So the standard specifically says that a therapeutic relationship cannot be discontinued for the purposes of pursuing a personal relationship. So that would be different than if you recognize that you're developing feelings for a patient or the patient is developing feelings for you, and there's a boundary violation that could occur. It's important at those points to recognize that before the boundary violation occurs, that you transfer that patient to another therapist for those reasons. Um, that's different than discharging someone so that you can start dating them. So no, it wouldn't be appropriate to discharge someone for the purposes of starting to date them. You would want to recognize that you'd have to wait at least that full year before pursuing any kind of romantic relationship. Back to you, Kenya.
All right, so thank you so much, MC. We are now going to be launching a very, very quick test your knowledge question. And this is true or false. Comments of a sexual nature made by a physiotherapist towards a patient are considered to be sexual abuse. So I'll give you a couple of moments to select your answer. Hopefully not too intimidating of a pop quiz. And thank you for sharing the answer. Yes, the answer is true. Under the law, it does include comments or conduct, behavior, or remarks of a sexual nature. And all of those things embody sexual abuse and should be refrained from, must be refrained from. All right, so with that, do we have any questions about the sexual abuse standard? Okay, so again, feel free to type in anything that comes up, but if not, we will chug right along to our very last standard for today, the supervision standard. And so it's interesting here because while the other two standards have been divorced from one combined standard, this one actually now combines two, but soon to be retired standards. So those are working with PTAs and supervision. And this standard will come into effect on February 1st, which is just a few short days away. So say your goodbyes to our two current standards. Okay, not a lot new in here as well. We're going to see a lot of combined concepts. The purpose of this standard is that physiotherapists are responsible and accountable for the PT services provided by those working under their supervision or their supervisee. So supervisee might be a newer concept here. And they are also responsible for providing supervision that is appropriate according to the patient's needs, the skills of the supervisee, and the context in which they practice. Patients can expect to be informed about the roles and responsibilities of the supervisees involved in their care, to have consented to supervisee involvement, and that the services that they provide, the supervisees, are adequately supervised by the physiotherapist. Now, the standard might look a little bit intimidating from the get-go just because of how long it is, but again, a lot of what's here combines what is already in the supervision and PTA standards. So the standard is divided into 4 sections to hopefully make it a little bit easier to navigate and reference. It starts off with a section for all supervision activities that apply to all supervisees. There is then a section for supervising physiotherapist assistants, so the additional requirements there. Then it goes into the additional requirements for supervising PT students. And then the last one is regarding other members of the profession, such as physiotherapist residents. So first, when it comes to all supervision activities, you must ensure on an ongoing basis that the supervisee, whoever they are, has the knowledge, skills, and judgment necessary to deliver safe and competent care. And you must tailor your supervision approaches and strategies according to factors like their competence, the patient's needs and goals, any risks that you identify, and your practice environment, so where you are practicing. So this is an ongoing process that involves monitoring and evaluating your supervisee service delivery, how the patient is responding, etc., and adjusting your approach wherever is needed. Next, you must explain to your patients who your supervisees are and what they will be responsible for. So supervisees should not be total strangers to your patient. Your patient must obtain informed consent for their involvement, And in general, if a patient is receiving services from supervisees, you must make sure that your supervisees can be identified by the patient. So in the standard, it provides the example of introductions or name tags, but this can be any way to identify those supervisees. In addition to communicating with patients, the standard also highlights that you must communicate with your supervisees. So this should be in a timely manner, depending on what kind of supervision you have, so direct or indirect, and you must have a communication system in place or a plan in place. And the last requirement in the general section is to delegate only controlled acts that you are competent in and rostered to perform. And you must also reassign supervision when you are not available to supervise. So if you want to learn a little bit more about controlled acts, there's a separate standard for that one as well. In addition to the general requirements, the expectations related to supervising PTAs include making sure that you're listed as a supervisor of PTAs on the public register, making sure that PTA documentation meets the college's standards, and that their name and job title appears on invoices where they provided some treatment. If you do appoint an alternate supervisor for any reason, you must make sure that they are competent and can assume full responsibility for PTA services. If an alternate supervisor is not designated and you cannot fulfill your supervisory responsibilities for whatever reason, delivery of PTA services must also be discontinued according to the standard. And the last part of that section is just highlighting a list of things that PTAs must not be assigned. So this includes most controlled acts. It includes discharge planning, although they can be involved with the discharge process. And importantly, it involves anything that requires independent clinical reasoning. So this, according to the standard, can include initial assessments, reassessments, interpretations of referrals, or assessment findings, determining or modifying a treatment plan, and initial discussion of rationale findings or prognosis with patients. So all of those things require independent action and therefore must not be assigned to PTAs. Next, we have the additional requirements for supervising PT students. Like with PTAs, you must make sure that their record keeping is consistent with the college's standards, that their names and titles are listed on invoices for transparency, and that services are discontinued if you cannot provide appropriate supervision. Importantly, student documentation must always be co-signed by the supervisor and must include their name. When it comes to controlled acts, there are a lot more controlled acts that PT students can do, but they must only be delegated with direct supervision until the student demonstrates a consistent level of competency. And then lastly, when it comes to other registered members of the profession, such as PT residents, there are just a couple of additional things to the general requirements to be mindful of. So first, you must ensure that the supervised member performs only those activities that the supervisor is themselves competent to perform and supervise, and you must maintain records that demonstrate the appropriateness of your supervision when taking into consideration the patient's needs, any risks, and other factors related to your practice environment. So I will now turn over to MC for the final time to talk through some of the more practical pieces about this standard.
Thank you, Evgenia. So what's new on this in this standard? As Evgenia said, we've merged the supervision and the working with PTA standards. That term of supervisee encompasses anyone to whom you're assigning care. So that would be could be a PT resident, it could be a physio student, or it could be an assistant. Really, what's new with this is just the shape and how it's been organized. You, as the physiotherapist, remain responsible for ensuring how you explain the role of the person that you're assigning care to the patient or their substitute decision maker. You're responsible for explaining who will be involved, what their role is, ensuring that you have consent from the patients or their substitute decision maker, and how that they are going to be able to identify that person working with them. That's such a common frustration that patients call about, that they didn't know that they were working with a student, or they didn't realize the person they were working with was a resident or was an assistant. So that expectation that they're clearly identified is an important one in the standard. Essentially, though, your responsibilities and the expectations on you when you're assigning and supervising remain unchanged from the previous supervision standard. This just laid out and organized a little bit differently. Um, Again, this standard reminds us that as physios, we should not assign care to someone with whom we have a close personal relationship. If circumstances exist that force that to happen, for example, in a smaller community, you are expected to put places and steps in place to mitigate any kind of conflict or potential for lack of objectivity. Ongoing communication with anyone who you have assigned care to is always an expectation. Monitoring and evaluating the care provided by someone to whom you've assigned care is still an expectation. You're only delegating controlled acts that you are rostered to deliver, and only if the expectation is that it meets the controlled act standard. So, as a reminder, you can delegate controlled acts to physiotherapy students if they are with you on clinical placement as part of the training to become a physiotherapist, part of their program, and it's under direct supervision. You can delegate controlled acts of oxygen titration, tracheal suctioning, wound care to PT assistants if they are competent to deliver the care safely. And as always, the requirement for a written protocol for communication continues, as well as the requirement for assigning that alternate supervisor if you can't supervise adequately. So some of the questions that were sent in ahead of time about the supervision standard was around how do I communicate with patients around who's involved in their care. So, think of the patient-centered communication module. Think of some of those principles around using plain language, using very clear titles. Try not to use titles that are confusing, like exercise therapist, my associate, things that wouldn't be obvious to a patient what that role is. When you're supervising students, the question was, when do I have to use direct supervision? And the answer on that one is really you have to use direct supervision until that student has demonstrated that they can provide care safely and competently. So you are assessing them and following the guidance as well from the university where that student's coming from, as well as your expectations from within this standard. Some bigger facilities, some assistants are working with a title of rehab assistant because they also receive assignment of care from occupational therapists and nursing, for example. So the question came in around which activities are physiotherapists responsible for? Is it just the ones that I assign to them, or is it all of the activities that assistant is performing? And you are only responsible for the care that you are assigning to an assistant. So if someone is working with assistant in that multidisciplinary model, you are only responsible for the care that you're assigning to them. There's a question around how do I work with employers who are not physios, but they are recruiting or selecting assistants for me to work with. So that can be a little bit of a dance. You are responsible for the care being provided by an assistant, and you are responsible for ensuring their competency. We do have resources on the college website around the essential competency framework for PTAs, but also, consider what tasks you'll be assigning to that assistant. What do you need them to be competent in? Can you work with the employer to create that list of what skills that are needed? Is there an opportunity for you to participate in the assessment of competency? I would say is always an option as well. One of the other questions that came in was, can a physio assistant triage new physio referrals sent to a clinic using the clinic's criteria, or does that have to come from a physio? I think that question, the answer to that one is a very unhelpful. It depends on the decision making that's being required. So if, for example, part of the triage rule is to slot patients into being post-operative and needing immediate care versus having a chronic condition and being able to wait a little bit longer, it might be appropriate for a PTA to be following that triage pieces. However, if it's a decision around whether or not that person is valid for care or it has to be discharged based on criteria, then likely a physiotherapist would need to be involved in some of that decision making. And then finally, one of the questions that came in was, can we have an OT supervising a physiotherapy student during placement if the physiotherapist is sick in a hospital and where patient mobility is a shared duty? So again, it depends. Likely if the OT has the necessary competencies and expertise to supervise those specific skills that the PT student needs to be performing or delivering during that day, then it might be appropriate. If there are skills that the PT student is expected to perform that the OT doesn't have, it might not be within their scope or they don't have the skills, then it wouldn't be appropriate for that day to be delivering the care without supervision. Okay, Evgenia, over to you.
All right. It might not be over to me, MC, because I think we have a couple of questions in the chat
Okay,
about the supervision standard.
great. So we have a question. In the purpose statement, would physiotherapy services equate to the tasks and activities that are assigned? What's your policy lens on that, Evgenia?
Yeah, so essentially it would be that. So anything that you assign to your supervisee that is related to the care that is, being delivered or talked about, then that would include the tasks activities um, that are assigned by you. So essentially, if you as a supervisor are assigning some portion of the care of a patient who came in for physiotherapy services and they require physiotherapy services, then that would be considered the physiotherapy services that that supervisee is performing. Absolutely.
Great.
I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Oh, perfect. And then there's a question around can we still assign controlled acts like tracheal suctioning, wound care, and administering substance inhalation to PTA? Yes. As long as you have assessed their competency and they have been shown to be able to deliver it safely and competently as well. And you yourself have to be rostered in order to delegate to them. PT students don't have the limitation. PT students can be assigned any of the controlled acts that you are rostered for as long as you are providing direct supervision. So there's a follow-up question. If the PTA goes beyond the assignment, the PT is not accountable. You can only be accountable for the care that you're assigning. If a PTA has gone off script, if a PTA has decided to work beyond their scope, you're expected to be providing a suitable level of supervision. So if you identify activities that the PTA is doing without supervision, that would be important for you to have a meeting with them, with your organization to talk about this as a patient safety risk, that there's care being provided that wasn't assigned as part of the treatment plan. PTAs are an unregulated professional at this point. They're not part of a college. And so from a college point of view, a PTA is anyone to whom a physiotherapist is assigning care as part of the treatment plan. So a lot of larger organizations have specific credentials that they would like to see a PTA have. So for example, they want them to be graduated from an accredited PTA college program, but that's not a college requirement. That is an organization requirement. And there's a question about, does a physiotherapist have to co-sign the notes written by a PTA student? So that depends on who is considered to be the supervisor of that PTA student. If you are their direct supervisor, you should be co-signing their notes. If you are not their direct supervisor, then their direct supervisor should be co-signing their notes. Okay, 12:59. We've got one
That's
last poll for you.
Yep, we're going to power through one last poll. So very quickly, after having reviewed everything today, what is your reaction to the new standards? No right or wrong answer, just something to help us gauge where we might need a little bit of additional, support and where to focus our efforts. So giving you guys a couple of moments to respond once more. we will not be offended either way. So candor is appreciated. Okay, so we're neutral, we're optimistic. Some of us are frustrated, and that is okay. I completely understand all of those approaches. We do aim for the changes to be manageable and not add any additional burden to your daily practice. And we do hope to also live up to your optimism and keep working to develop guidance and other resources to help. So, really, just to close off for today, I would like to extend a huge thank you to each and every one of you for being here over your lunch, for your engagement now and throughout the 2 years that we've been undergoing this process. So, always know that the college's practice advice service is here to help you if any other questions come up, if you need support or advice. This is a free anonymous service, and MC, who is with us today, of course, and Samira are both very friendly, knowledgeable, experienced physiotherapists who are an amazing resource for any questions related to practice. MC, would you like to say anything before we end our webinar?
Oh, just thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate your participation and your engagement. And if you have follow-up questions that we didn't get to, or you think of something later on, by all means, give us a call, send us an email. We answer calls and emails within 48 hours always. So we encourage you to reach out to us. We're so happy to hear from you.